doing
This
that
conference
yet.
will now be recorded.
So we're going to have Richard Smardon. He's a Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at SUNY ESF. His area of expertise, environmental science, and is particularly the visual impact assessment methodology, in which he has 20 years of project management and experience in. He holds a PhD in environmental planning from University of California at Berkeley. He is a landscape architect out of the University of Massachusetts, and bachelor's work in environmental design at University of Massachusetts. He's a major contributor to the book, The Renewable Energy Landscape, which I understand is fantastic. And I should also say that Richard has been helpful to Greening USA over the years. He's a president of the Central New York Land Trust, and we have collaborated on a number of things together. So Richard, when I reached out to Richard about this topic, he volunteered within minutes. So thank you, Richard. And he reached out, he said, I know someone that can really speak about this, Emanuel Carter, who is also a professor at ESF in the landscape architecture program, and with the architecture program at ESF is devoted to the viable, sustainable integration of natural and cultural communities. Professor Carter focuses on planning and urban design, and his studies are at the intersection of politics and design, and in thinking of cities as ecosystems. Professor Carter was educated at Cornell University and holds a Master of Regional Planning from that institution. He's taught at not only Cornell and Syracuse University, but his present position at SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry. He also has practical experience working in the planning departments and as a consulting planner and landscape architect. I suppose there's a lot more to tell you about each of these people, but I think we'll hear it from them. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Smardon to start us off today.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the great introduction. Always happy to be presenting, or discussing more and taking questions as well. So just a quick overlook. Biodiversity, what it means and why it's important for survival. The first part, I'll start off and give some background, and then Professor Carter is going to come in and tell us specifically about the new Center of Biosphere Studies at SUNY ESF, which is pretty exciting. So in part one, I'll talk a little bit about what the International Convention on Biodiversity is, kind of how it got started. Talk a little bit about creation of biosphere reserves that are all over the world and in different parts of the world with different kinds of ecological systems. And then we're going to try to connect it to the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals and come up with connect it to the summit that John just talked about in New York City in September. And then Emanuel's going to talk both about the creation of the Center of Biosphere Studies at SUNY ESF, which is brand new. And then he's going to give an example of the Lake Champlain Basin Adirondack Biosphere Preserve, or really what they call a network, which is in New York, Vermont, and up into Canada. So without further ado, so the UNESCO Convention on Biodiversity really started in about 1983 in Minsk, Belarus. I always think it's interesting because some of these international conventions start in the darndest places, like the Wetland Convention. The Ramsar Convention started in Ramsar, Iran. Who would have thought? But anyhow, work started on 1983, and it since was voted on by 150 countries at Rio de Janeiro at the Big Green Conference in 1992. And it has major objectives, which is always interesting to go back to these and kind of think, well, They just want to conserve biodiversity, right? But there's more to it. So the three major goals are really conservation of biological diversity. We're talking about species, we're talking about habitats, et cetera, at all different scales. And then the second part is sustainable use of resources. Now, this is interesting because about half the world's population is really dependent upon nature, basically, for the sustenance. So that's why they put in sustainable use of resources. Okay, so it's number two. Number three, fair and equitable use of genetic resources, an appropriate transfer of relevant technologies, rights, and funding. Now, this part gets really controversial, right? Because you think of all those folks that are going down to Mexico and Central America and trying to get drugs and trying to produce drugs from those, and that gets into the whole issue of rights and whose technical knowledge, whose genetic resources, and how does this get transferred in terms of use in terms of our modern everyday life. So it's kind of interesting to revisit that and think about that. So there's three different goals really to the Convention on Biodiversity. So if we look at biosphere reserves, it really started about 1984, the whole notion of creating large areas that we could preserve biodiversity. And not to be confused with parks, right? Because parks usually think about people, intensively using these areas. Supposedly, the major rationale for biosphere reserves is to preserve species, habitats, and genetic diversity. And so this led to establishment of biosphere reserves all around the whole world. And there's a meeting every 3 years, a meeting of the parties every 3 years. So if you look back in the last few COPs, there seems to be sort of three major areas that they've been looking at. One is how you manage these biosphere reserves. Now, early on, I was involved about 20 years ago in some work in Mexico. And they have 10 major biosphere reserves in Mexico scattered throughout the country. And I was looking at some of the biosphere reserves around the Gulf of Mexico and in the interior of the Great Mayan Biosphere Reserve. And the problem is they were sort of coming up with management of these biosphere reserves by the Mexican government agencies. Well, sometimes they would connect with the community and sometimes they wouldn't. And then when you'd ask the people in the community about what they thought of the biosphere reserves, you got very nasty reactions because they didn't really involve the community in management planning for a lot of these biosphere reserves. So the whole thing is you got to tie this thing together because you still have people living there and using those resources. Now, the second thing is there are many different scales of reserves. It could be individual biosphere reserves like within a country, or like the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in southern Mexico is really 3 different countries. It covers Belize, Guatemala, and Mexico. So it's like a transboundary biosphere reserve. And Emmanuel's going to talk about the Lake Champlain Adirondack Reserve again, which is 2 countries and multiple states. So you can have different scales in terms of these biosphere reserves. And the last piece, which is particularly important, is economic management policy, ecosystem services, and who benefits. So my work with the Mexican biosphere reserves, the key thing was, can you have fisheries? Can you have extractive resources? Can you have hunting? Can you have ecotourism? Who benefits from that? Who benefits from, doing these sort of ecologically oriented services? And nature by themselves, of course, deliver what we call ecosystem services. There's things that we don't pay for, but we get anyhow from nature. So it's important to look at biosphere reserves, how this whole thing works and who benefits. And I was involved a few years ago with Emanuel in looking at the biosphere reserves in Chile. And the big problem in Chile was they had so much area. This country is 3,000 miles long, right? With 10 different regions in multiple large-scale biosphere reserves. So the problem is, how do you manage these areas without people not using them well, or there's too much traffic and they can't keep track of it, and there's ecological damage. So the whole management policy is very, very important, both from maintaining the ecological resiliency and integrity of the reserve, but also trying to figure out how local people can benefit from the reserves themselves. So then you had the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals, right? There's 17 goals, you can see here on the slide. And about 14 of these, at least 14 of these goals really can be directly linked to Biosphere Reserve management and development of ecosystem services. So there's a lot on that, and a lot of it's tied with your current activity with the Greening USA. So as John said, there was a meeting held in New York City on September 30th, 2020. And they were supposed to address the following policy issues: the 2020 Global Diversity Framework, 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, 2050 Vision for Biodiversity, and of course COP16 was supposed to be in 2020, but it's being put off until 2021. So they're supposed to deal with all these different things at this one meeting in New York City. And as John said, you know, part of these meetings is to say, well, okay, where are we now? What progress have we made or not made? And of course, for species extinction, we've got hundreds of times more of species being extinct than, say, a few years ago. We're talking about 75% of the Earth's surface significantly altered, and 66% of the ocean have multiple impacts which are occurring. And I'm reading a lot of this fishery impacts right now, and it's a little bit depressing, plus the climate change impacts. So the other part of the summit was really, okay, let's look at the Sustainable Development Goals and how do they relate to biodiversity. And this is especially important for food security, health, livelihoods, jobs, water security, the ocean health, climate change, and disaster prevention. And so all this stuff together is really linked to biodiversity. Now, to me, this is sort of going back, even prior to Rio, there was actually another meeting by UNESCO in, I think it was Istanbul, Turkey. And the focus of that meeting was what we call the Brown Agenda, elimination of poverty. So now we're coming back around again to linking both the green agenda and the brown agenda, you know, the environmental agenda and the sustainability of society, if you will, and specific communities, plus dealing with the global issues that we're dealing with. So the summit basically was looking at the loss of diversity critical to poverty alleviation, sustainable jobs, economic development, and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So again, bringing these things together. And of course, the big push was people depend on a healthy planet for human health. To me, this is really critical because if you're going to make the argument about the impact of climate change, there's no better way to doing it, to tying it back to the effect on human health. And that really brings it home in the terms that, you know, the ordinary folks can kind of understand. Also, biodiversity is key to human equity in ecosystem services. If you look at what's happening right now with COVID, if you look at what's happening with the disease around the world, if you look at the major impacts to ecology around the world, certain people are really losing big. And those are usually the folks that are have less, quote, economic income and are directly tied to the environment in which they live. So to me, this is really, really a critical issue. And the last issue they were going to focus on in the New York meeting was biodiversity restoration and nature-based solutions, and how they meet UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals. So we have a big push in New York right now, for instance, in terms of using green infrastructure, right, to address water quality issues, to also address coastal issues from storms and climate-induced impacts. Even in the Great Lakes, we're seeing the need for, quote, nature-based solutions rather than concrete and steel or gray infrastructure. Let's look at what the role can be for nature-based solutions. And my own work is with wetlands actually being used for actually water quality treatment. So it all ties kind of back together. So these are the major issues that they were trying to deal with at the summit in New York City just recently. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and Emanuel Carter is going to lead us off in the next segment. Emanuel?
Okay, thank you, Rick. You know, Rick mentioned at the beginning of his presentation that the SUNY ESF has a new Center for Biosphere Reserve Studies, and we were established in December of 2019, and lucky enough to get 2 meetings in before we all had to go back home, you know, for COVID reasons. And so we've been a little slower getting underway than we had anticipated, but there's still some interesting things going on, and our momentum does continue to build. The purpose of establishing this center is to broaden the range of research that we do at ESF, broaden our public service mission, and also to see if we can establish a new major in biosphere reserve management. One of the things that we've discovered in our readings and in our discussions with people engaged with biosphere reserves is that the management skills necessary are really pretty broad and yet interlocking. The biosphere reserves need people who know their science, but also know their administrative and social science, have administrative and social science skills as well, because they have to talk to community leaders and to citizens groups. And we want to keep in mind that one of the purposes of biosphere reserves is to monitor the evolution of how communities of various sizes, so right from hamlets and villages to metropolitan areas, are able to live within the envelope of these unique ecosystems around the world. So biosphere reserve management really does require a unique set of skills, and we're hoping that we might be able to start to provide those skills not only for North American facilities, but for biosphere reserves all over the world here at ESF. So the biosphere reserve system came out of the UNESCO Man in the Biosphere program, which began back in 1971. And the purposes of biosphere reserves in general is the protection and/or enhancement of biodiversity, sustainable interactions between communities and host ecosystems, more recently climate change monitoring and mitigation, and also they serve as frameworks for environmental and cultural reconciliation with indigenous peoples. Those purposes are addressed in varying degrees around the world. Some try to do all of them, some do some better than others. We are trying to take as many lessons as we can from the Canadians, who have 18 biosphere reserves and that make for an incredible variety from the Arctic right down to the Great Lakes. Hopefully we will be able to improve the American system by the things that we do learn from engaging the Canadians. We are hoping that the center will encourage the study of all currently 701 UNESCO biosphere reserves across 200 countries around the world. But we also want to have, as our initial focus, something that's a little bit closer to home. So we are going to be concentrating over the next 2 years on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed. I think you're all aware that the Joint Commission has set new lake levels. I guess that was back around 2014, and they no sooner did that than we started getting, probably as a result of global warming, record fall and spring rains, and so those lake levels have been encroaching on communities and landscapes throughout the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed. And although we have at ESF a Great Lakes Consortium, it isn't clear that there's any connection between that consortium and the biosphere reserves in the region. And we want to get those biosphere reserves, well, first of all, we want to discover what they're doing, and then secondly, see if we can encourage all of us to work together in support of ecological health in Great Lakes St. Lawrence. So we're hoping to work with the following organizations, and I'm going from from east to west: Manicouagan Uapishka, which is in Quebec, Charlevoix in Quebec, Lac Saint-Pierre, Mont Saint-Hilaire. All those are in Quebec. And then in Ontario, Frontenac Arch, Long Point, which is on Lake Erie. Frontenac Arch, by the way, is on the Canadian side of Thousand Islands. Niagara Escarpment, Georgian Bay, and then in the United States, Champlain, Adirondack, University of Michigan Biological Station, and Isle Royale, which is out in sort of the north central part of Lake Superior. So we had hoped by this time to have visited at least half of those, or maybe more, but in a time of COVID, people are happy enough to exchange emails, but they don't want you to come visit. So we are hoping that we'll be able to start this coming summer and getting out there. So the center has 2 locations. So most of us are based on the Syracuse main campus of ESF, but we also have ESF's Adirondack Ecological Center up in Newcomb, New York. And we have a team up there that is, well placed to be not only in the Adirondacks themselves, but closer to Lake Champlain. And we also have a good relationship with the University of Vermont, where they have, a couple of people whose expertise lies in Adirondack work. We also thought that, it would be a good idea to have a home biosphere reserve, one that we can serve directly, and learn more about what biosphere reserves are all about by being of service to the ups and downs of one that is close to us. So we are directly in service as a center to the Champlain Adirondack, they call it the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. And network is a term of caution because reserve implies no in some ways, and the folks in the Adirondacks in particular are, a little difficult with that concept. So Biosphere Network, it is a network of networks, as the steering committee members like to say. In our neighborhood, and simply meaning those close to us, we have Frontenac Arch, which actually has a twinning agreement with Champlain Adirondack, and they have mentored Champlain Adirondack as it went through a recent process of reconstituting itself as a viable biosphere network, having been originally established in 1989 and then gone dormant during the 90s. So, so we are looking to establish some interesting engagements with, meaning we at ESF at the center, with Frontenac Arch, and also with Mont Saint-Hilaire, which is on the southeast side of the St. Lawrence near Montreal, and Lac Saint-Pierre, which is at Sorel, Quebec, and that's where the waters of Lake Champlain empty into the St. Lawrence River, just below Lac Saint-Pierre. So we're hoping that we will be in constant engagement with these 3 biosphere reserves, just because they're physically close. Getting out to Michigan and and such is going to require a bit of a reach, and we'll have to have a stronger sense of what our joint agendas might be before we get working out that far west. So the center is currently working with Champlain Adirondack and Frontenac Arch to develop research and public service agendas. We've already been approached by Frontenac Arch to take a look at their rural villages. They say that they're meeting their goals in terms of environmental monitoring and environmental conservation and environmental enhancement, but that their rural villages are still failing, and they wanted to know, does ESF have anybody that can look into, small rural communities? And because we were the institution that founded a nationwide workshop called Your Town your town designing its future, I think we are in a good place to help Frontenac Arch. Champlain Adirondack is still trying to decide how we might best help them, but they're much newer, and their steering committee is only now beginning to shape initial agendas. Fortunately for ESF, through Champlain Adirondack, we're also working with University of Vermont and Paul Smith's College, and we're hoping that as soon as COVID is over, that we will have a great deal of engagement with them, especially regarding coursework that we can share in the Adirondacks and in other parts of, and in various parts of the Lake Champlain Basin. And we hope that after we are up and running with our neighborhood biosphere reserves, that we will have greater opportunities for working with Queen's University, which is already working in support of Frontenac Arch, and McGill University, which is working in support of Mont Saint-Hilaire, and University of Quebec at Trois-Rivières, which is working with Lac Saint-Pierre. So we are hoping that ESF will have an interesting new network of sibling institutions to work with in the foreseeable future. This coming spring semester, between February and April, the center will be working with Champlain Adirondack to deliver 5 virtual seminars for all of the government, corporate, not-for-profit, and citizen partners that essentially constitute the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network, to help them understand what it means to participate in the Biosphere Reserve and to contribute to biodiversity and cultural diversity. So we'll be, I guess the first couple of seminars are going to be about, what is a Biosphere Reserve, and how can you live in it, and how can you contribute to it. But then we're going to have a session that is very specifically about how Champlain Adirondack can work to implement, I guess, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals within its boundaries and beyond. I think there will be I think the 4th one is going to address youth issues. So we'll be using Shelburne Farms and the Wild Center to, we'll be talking to those people so that they can then reach out to school districts. And we're also talking about reaching out directly to school districts through the ESF and the high schools program. And then the 5th one, I think, has more to do with potentials for broader research and public service agendas. So we're going to do these every 2 weeks, beginning in mid-February and ending in early April, and which will be just in time to allow us to focus on the usual stresses of the end of the semester. So far, the center has reached out to all 11 biosphere reserves in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed, and we expect that as soon as there's a vaccine that is valid, that we will be leaving Syracuse and getting out to these 10 other biosphere reserves, not including our home biosphere reserve, and visit people and discuss opportunities for collaboration. We do have some current coursework on biosphere reserves. Last January, we initiated an introductory seminar on biosphere reserves. We had 4 students, 1 grad, 3 undergrad, but it's an elective, and they were incredibly active and productive. And unfortunately, our momentum was interrupted by COVID, but we persevered, and the students did some very interesting presentations, which we will be able to share with other people as we move forward. We had intended this past summer to have a mobile seminar on biosphere reserves. Brian Halsey, one of our team members who used to direct the Adirondack Ecological Center, he and I did a visit August of 19 to Mont Saint-Hilaire, Lac Saint-Pierre, and Frontenac Arch. And after those visits, thought that it would be good to have a 2-week mobile seminar that would take us back to those. So starting in Champlain, Adirondack, and going around to the other 3 in our neighborhood, and then coming back for debriefing. So hopefully that might be something we can do this coming August. And then our colleagues at the Adirondack Ecological Center are trying to put together a residential semester to do biosphere reserve studies there, and they also, I'm sure, would include going out to our friends to visit our friends in Canada. The center's work right now is also in a position to benefit from having one of our team members, Brian Halsey, serve as the current head of the U.S. MAB program. It's something that had to be established almost in secrecy this past summer, just because the MAB work is not supported by the Trump administration, but we're hoping that as of January, that the work of that team will be able to sort of see daylight, and I hope we can get a lot of advantage from the fact that one of our members is working at the national level. So finally, we are hoping not only to enhance, use the center to enhance academic offerings at ESF, but to also help citizens, business, and industry, to understand how to pursue UNESCO's 17 Sustainable Development Goals throughout the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence watershed. So stay tuned, be patient with us, but we're hoping that maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, we can come back to this forum and say, here are some of our recent achievements, and this is how our momentum is going, and we're starting to make a difference out there. So let's hope that's the way it works out. Thank you.
Yeah, just a few things. Just a few references. Those that are interested in the UN Convention on Biodiversity, there's the website, UN Summit on Biodiversity, UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals, and a few other of my old publications thrown in there, just for your reference.
Great, thank you, Rick, and thank you, Emanuel, for your fine presentations. We will entertain questions from the audience, and I would suggest one of 2 ways. You can either just type the word question into the chat, and I will try to recognize it, and I'm sure I'll have some help with that from our speakers and Diane to see that and get you called on, or you can type the question if you wish, but there's no need to do that right into the chat. Maybe I will just start by asking a broad question, and that is, Emanuel, what's the difference between, old school conservation versus biodiversity and biosphere reserve studies? Is it a matter of semantics? Is it the tie into the sustainable development goals? What is different about this approach?
Okay, so the older idea about setting up reserves or conservation zones or things of that sort, the emphasis really was solely on protecting an area that might be rich in biodiversity, largely by either not letting people into it or by seriously managing how people have access to it. So it's a kind of, state parks or national parks model. And some of the earlier biosphere reserves, in fact, operated on that model, even though that was not UNESCO's intention. And by the way, the extent to which that was the case in North America or in the United States is shown by the fact that the Biosphere Reserve program here was put into the hands of the National Park Service, all right? So, but what UNESCO really wants is to have each Biosphere Reserve be a laboratory in which we not only conserve or enhance biodiversity, but where we also can study how do communities of various types manage to survive and evolve inside these biosphere reserves, so within the envelope of their opportunities and constraints. So some biosphere reserves are looking at how nomadic groups behave in Mongolia or in Western China, for example. Others are looking at how cities in Wales are able to be real urban places inside the context of a biosphere reserve. The real intent is to look at, can people tailor their behaviors in their community behaviors in ways that allow humankind to flourish, but also allow the host ecosystem to flourish. And the hope then is that we find ways to do that, and then we share that information with each other around the world. And in that sense, we are teaching each other, and in a sense, teaching ourselves, since it's not a top-down, it's a bottom-up approach, teaching ourselves how to behave well in these environmental contexts.
I see.
It's Rick, just a few throw-ins. I agree with what Emanuel said, but the whole thing has progressed. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in the year 2000 said, here's a way that we can more quantify the ecosystem services that these areas provide to us as a society. And then you throw in climate change on top of that, and sustainability goals on top of that, and the whole thing evolves to a much more inclusive package.
Yes, because not everyone was quite understanding UNESCO's intent, so they have offered prompt after prompt, if you will, about how we should be thinking about this.
I see. Thank you. Are there other questions from audience members? And while I don't see anything right in the chat right now, it's interesting to hear that the other universities that are involved in that was going to be one of my questions as you were talking about whether or not there are other centers across the country or across the globe doing a similar effort as is being launched here at ESF, and it sounds like there are other places doing this type of work.
Well, there are other places that are working with biosphere reserves and working in biosphere reserves, but they're doing it in what I guess I would think of as the more traditional approach. They're supporting conservation biology. They are supporting, climate change monitoring and those kinds of things. There's one small institution in France that purports to be training biosphere reserve managers, but none of the schools that we're cooperating with right now, and hoping to cooperate much more deeply with shortly, none of those schools are trying to train professional managers for biosphere reserve work. So we are, because there's such a vacuum about this, we are actually in a position to make a major contribution to the definition of what it means to be a biosphere reserve manager, which is different than training really good ecologists to do research work in biosphere reserves.
I see. We had a question from Joshua Wilcox about legislation or potential legislation that may be necessary, or action that municipalities could pass or create or undertake on the local or religious regional level. And it does seem that, like you mentioned this is bottom up, and that the local level is where this begins, kind of like what Greening USA has kind of adopted from the UN model, that sustainability starts at the local level. But I suppose at all levels of government, there probably needs to be some legislative authorizations that may help with this matter. What can you tell us about that?
John, this is Rick again. There's a couple examples in New York State. In the Hudson River Valley, people have been working with BARD and some of the other schools to develop sort of ecological planning, actually ecological planning and zoning in communities like Rhinebeck and Red Hook, New York, and Hudson River Valley. And then in Saratoga County, they have a green infrastructure plan. Basically, it's a combination of open space planning plus green infrastructure to maintain water and air quality. So we are, even in New York State, we're seeing some examples here and there, and it ties in with the local comprehensive planning process.
Rick, is there a requirement at the state level for municipalities in New York State or regions to have a conservation or biosphere planning process?
Not that I know of.
Okay. So yeah, that might be something.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead,
think that,
Emanuel.
Yeah, the UNESCO, I think, really doesn't want, they don't want to create the sense of any kind of top-down approach with biosphere reserves. They want the various urban and rural communities within each biosphere reserve to take stock and to figure out at the local level, what do they have to do to manage their own stability and their own evolution while maintaining the environmental quality of their host ecosystem. And it's a hard thing because communities have to literally figure it out. UNESCO is not going to offer you a set of rules. They're not going to offer you a financial incentive. They're not going to offer political incentives. What they're saying is that, here are the 17 sustainability development goals. Here are our various treatises or analyses on ecosystem services and the other benefits from viable ecosystems, and how do you at the village level or the town or county or city or state level, how do you want to meet those goals with legislation tailored to your individual communities and maybe the communities around you? So one of the things that we're probably going to find in Champlain, Adirondack, is that the people in the Adirondack communities are probably going to have a little bit of whiplash because, the Adirondack Park, which was in a sense a first shot at a biosphere reserve before anybody would have used this term, is a very top-down approach, and there are the rules, which make a lot of lower-level municipalities chafe, even though they may benefit in many ways. Then now these same people are in a biosphere network, and the steering committee is saying to them, we're not a government. We are simply sort of managing the implementation of a concept that asks you, community by community, to figure out how you might live in this new definition of I'll say state, small s, because it crosses state boundaries. And we want people to learn how to feel as if they are citizens of an ecosystem. And I think that's what UNESCO would like people all over the world to get from this kind of framework. We are citizens of an ecosystem.
Yeah, Emmanuel, can I put a plug in?
Sure.
We have, John, we have local things called land trusts. In the New York State, if you look at what's Finger Lakes Land Trust and our own land trust in central New York and other land trusts throughout the whole state of New York, these are kind of functioning like miniature biosphere reserve managers in a way. The areas aren't necessarily big except for, say, the Adirondacks or Lake George or some parts of the Hudson River Valley, but it's kind of a similar concept. How can we manage natural areas and then provide access for use of those areas on a very limited basis?
Right, right. And I think another example may be, like we're going to hear next month, about the Skaneateles Lake watershed and how that is being managed so that the city of Syracuse can use it as a water supply without having to filter the water through doing conservation management strategies and which is typically in Skaneateles, a rural farming watershed.
And the Central Land Trust is working with the Skaneateles Lake group as well.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And maybe we'll call on you, Rick, next month to pitch in with Frank Moses. We haven't put together the speakers, but I hope you're at least in the audience next month. And are there other questions? Let's see. I got to scroll down. I see. I have to scroll here from Linda. Linda asked, and I'm reading this firsthand here. You can open up your mic if you wish, Linda. But you wrote, how do we help frame the how do we help frame the essential conversation that integrates the economy of the biosphere into a worldwide economic system that rarely quantifies the magnitude of these benefits. Currently, the U.S. erroneously views supporting the economy in a pandemic that ultimately sacrifices the health of its people. Do you think it's possible to change this harmful economic paradigm moving forward? You got to be able to. You must believe that it is, or else you wouldn't be working in the business.
Let me take a shot at that. The hope, I think UNESCO's hope is that we will, after a certain amount of years of working in biosphere reserves, watching what works and what doesn't, that we will eventually learn to kind of voluntarily limit our wants, okay? And that in limiting our wants, we are changing our economic model. And in changing our economic model, we are changing the way in which we use resources. I think that a lot of the unspoken goal of biosphere reserves is getting citizens of communities to understand they don't have to have it all the time. And again, I think you wouldn't state it that way if UNESCO wouldn't state it that way, because that sounds like they're interested in global deprivation, or it could be misconstrued that way. But I think part of the goal is to help people of all kinds of societies around the world limit their wants, realize that how fragile a membrane our biosphere is, and that then there's a direct relationship between our ability to have self-restraint and to survive as beings. So I think it's a good question, and it does go right to the heart, actually, of UNESCO's intentions.
Yeah, this is Rick. I got 3 points. One is we have to have a metric such as ecosystem service to show what nature really provides us, right? And sometimes that gets left out of the calculation, but there are people that are working on this. Number two, we have to calculate the health benefit issue of climate change and other such things that show the real, quote, health benefits. And finally, agencies, US agencies right now, like US Environmental Protection Agency, are told to revise their cost benefit and risk assessments that devalue certain benefits, and that has to be changed, hopefully with the next administration.
Yeah, very good. Very good points. I see Joshua asked about, you know, this our American desires over the past 50 years, maybe 70 years, to expand, build more roads, suburbanize and exurbanize, and how do we really get a handle on that? I think it wasn't at Seattle that developed a boundary approach to it. I'm not sure how successful that has been, or was it Portland? I can't remember. I get confused. The cities out there on the West Coast. But what can you tell us about the prospect for reining in the Americans' desire for expansion?
I'll take a shot. I'm sure Rick has his own sense of this as well. I think you all realize that at the moment, land use laws in the United States are hard pressed to actually keep us from, you know, expanding across the landscape, you know, buying property and building on it more or less as we see fit. I think that one of the things that UNESCO would be trying to encourage us to do is to put forth new models of what it means to live in community. All right, you know, we've come. Okay, keep in mind that, I mean, yeah, even as late as the 1940s, Americans lived in the industrial city of the 19th century. Okay, they were dense, dirty, and noisy, and there were a lot of other, you know, difficult issues, not least of which was we were also redlining and depriving communities of viability in our economy. But so, you know, as a result, you know, we expanded out into suburbanization. It was our last great American migration, and part of that was justifiably about getting away from the density and dirt and noise of the 19th century industrial city. We now realize that living with more mileage and more acreage per person than anybody else on the planet is not so convenient or comfortable anymore, and we need to then put forth new models of what it means to live in community. And so, you know, I think that, you know, putting forth models, we can now do clean density. We can now make urban place, you know, coterminous with urban forest. You know, look at how many urban forestry teams there are working in American cities and cities around the world. You know, I live in a neighborhood. In fact, I'm looking out my back window right now at a neighborhood that is just full of trees and wildlife. We've got all manner of things that eat in our garden and you know, share all of our resources that I and my neighbors have. But we need to put that model forth as not only a desirable way to live, but as an economically reasonable way to live. And so I think that and for those of us trained in city planning, or those of us who de facto do it, we've got to push our decision makers to, you know, to work with those models. We also have to keep proving to those decision makers that those models are viable, get the case studies in front of them, get the rationale in front of them, and get people to start running for office on the grounds that, look, we can give you environmental quality through community density. But right now, that's still not the primary model that Americans are working with. but we need to change our model of what it means to live in place.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Go ahead, Rick.
Two factors. Economically and risk assessment. If you look at what's happening in coastal communities with climate change, with our low-lying coastal communities, and storm activity, you know, storms, damage, hurricanes, etc., water levels, the insurance industry and the banks are someday just going to say this is not feasible, right? So that could be a major factor when that risk gets really factored into the economic calculation of risk. And the second factor is the energy equation. You know, you just can't afford, if you look at climate change and energy consumption, it just doesn't make any sense anymore. And California is the only state that I know of that's had a comprehensive approach from 2008 to look at every major subdivision in terms of climate change impact and filter down through the whole regulatory process.
Yeah,
and of course, there are two fires that help them out too.
Right. I agree with you on that. Some legislation at the state levels to recognize what we're doing to ourselves, and like Paul writes in the chat from London, that you make greening a commodity that people want to buy, to make it easier to accept. Although I think it will be a hard sell for some Americans, as we see with some of the results of the recent election, although maybe some of the polls don't quite bear out that difficulty as much as the polls do. So hopefully there is it's going to be easier than it may appear to accomplish this. But changing the mindset starting at ground zero, I think will go a long way. So this is very exciting and encouraging. This approach, this biosphere management approach, is very exciting. I'm glad to hear about that. I don't know. Are there other questions from people? We usually go to about 1:30, so we have a few more minutes. But if they're not, we can wrap things up a little early. We can go outside and enjoy the nice, unusual November weather that we've been stuck in here for the last couple of weeks. I don't see anybody in there. It looks like maybe I should say going once, and I'll also give an opportunity if our panelists wish to make a final comment. We can give them the opportunity to do that before we close the meeting. Rick or Emanuel, is there anything else you want to share with us at this point?
One thing that comes to mind, you were talking about the next presentation will be addressing Skaneateles Lake. I have long thought that if we were to create another biosphere reserve in the United States in the foreseeable future, the Finger Lakes region would be it. And I would love to have New York have Champlain, Adirondack, and the Finger Lakes regions as biosphere reserves. I think they are deserving of that level of protection, but also deserving of that level of study. And I think the citizenry in the Finger Lakes would be attuned to conservation, a conservation ethic, and to managing their economies in ways that keep the lakes and their uplands in good health.
Just to follow up on that point, so is there a process or procedure that we can sort of look at to follow to start the ball rolling to make that happen?
UNESCO has a process. I would have to look around and figure out where you get the paperwork and who has to initiate it. I'm sure that we have to get some combination of the science community and local governments to agree upon boundaries for designation and and to get that ball rolling. But I would sure love to see that happen in the Finger Lakes.
Well, maybe we should form a task force and have a group come together and work on that. I remember years ago when the Onondaga Lake needed to have some remediation. We had committees. The Onondaga Lake committee was formed. There was some funding
Onondaga
for
Lake
it by the federal.
John.
Right. That's right. I remember Dr. Hennigan. I believe he's now passed. Was one of the key players in that whole process. I remember going to meetings at up at ESF, up in his office, talking about getting that started. The Salmon 2000 program was created. So maybe we need to have a group. Again, I had been thinking, and I kind of lost sight of my question, was like whether there's an activist group in place. Is it the Sierra Club or is it some other association that is in place that kind of follows and monitors and pushes for biosphere creation and progress? Does anybody know anything about that?
Well, John, I know a lot of the groups. I don't think there is specifically. Probably the Nature Conservancy is probably the closest one in New York State, probably. And they were behind the Lake Ontario Marine Historic Park process that is running through the procedures right now. NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration. So we've got one proposal for Heritage Park for Lake Ontario because of all the shipwrecks and history. So I think some combination of probably, and I was thinking the Finger Lakes Land Trust has proposed a regional strategy for managing resources, much more than the specific land holdings. So if you're talking Finger Lakes Land Trust would be a key player.
And there is there's also a Central and Western New York chapter of the Nature Conservancy. They're headquartered in Rochester.
Okay, thank you for that information. I just want to take a final look here. I see Joshua put something in here, but maybe it's he's referring to about the playing field is changing every day, and he comments about the geological history of the area. So much to work on here. So thank you very much for informing us today about this. We really appreciate you being here today. And if you like this program, come back to our other programs, tell your friends about it, and you'll be able to, they'll be able to watch this and listen to this on our YouTube channel. So pass the word. And Diane, do you have anything else you want to say before we close the meeting?
Just thank you to everyone for participating. We very much appreciate it. And tell your friends, and it'll be up on YouTube in a few days.
Great. Thanks to our speakers. Maybe we should all unmute and give them a round of applause for being here today. So long, everybody. We'll see you next month.